Well, hello. Thank you for tuning in today. Our Bible reading is going to be from Job chapter 3 today. Job chapter 3. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about yesterday's reading from chapter 2, and we're going to summarize what happened there, and then we're going to look at Job and his first reaction, first response to the things that have happened to him in recent days. So, once again in chapter 2, Satan appears before the Lord, just like he did in chapter 1. And in chapter 1, God held up Job and said, there's no one like this man in all of the earth. And so Satan unleashes and assaults Job and takes away his children and his wealth. And the text says in Job chapter 1 and verse 22 that Job did not sin. He did not blame God for anything. So then again in chapter 2, Satan comes before the Lord and you can almost see God saying, see, I told you he wasn't going to sin. And the charge that Satan had made in chapter 1, well, the only reason he serves you is because you've blessed him so much. Well, that's not true anymore. Job proved that. And so God holds him up and he says, see, I told you that wasn't the case. But Satan says, oh, okay, fine. But if you afflicted him, if you afflict him personally and you make him sick or you do something that's going to make his life worse, not just take the stuff away, not just remove his family members, but affect him, then he'll turn against you. And so God says in verse 6, he's in your power, but spare his life. And so the text says that Satan went, and it says that Job was afflicted with sores or boils on his body from his feet to his head. And it says in verse 8 that Job just took a broken piece of pottery and he was scraping the boils and the sores on his skin, presumably because they were itching and very uncomfortable, and that's the only way that he could find some relief. Now, in verse 9, Job's wife comes to him and she says, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, think about what Job's wife does here. And incidentally, it's interesting that Job's children are taken away in chapter 1, but his wife is not. And I'm not going to speculate as to why she was spared, but his children were not. But I do think it's interesting that his wife comes along and she encourages Job to do the very thing that Satan said Job would do in chapter 1. You take all his stuff away, he'll curse you. And his wife says, you should just curse God and die and end your suffering. Take your life so your misery can end. And she thinks Job's going to be better off to just turn away from God and escape the suffering that he's experiencing by taking his own life. Well, his wife is certainly not a source of encouragement, or she is no help to him here. She's encouraging him to do the very thing that the devil said he would do. And Job's response to her is excellent. He says, should we not accept adversity from God as well as the good things? And it says again in verse 10 that throughout all this, Job did not sin with his lips, or Job did not sin in what he said. Make sure that we don't take chapter 1 and verse 22, throughout all this, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. And chapter 2 and verse 10, throughout all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Don't take those two verses and apply them to the whole book. A lot of people do that, and I don't think that's right. Job is going to say some things in this book that are going to get him into trouble. I think those two statements apply to what has happened in the book thus far. Job did not sin at this point. Chapter 2, Job did not sin at this point. But Job is going to say some things later on as he begins to speak and dialogue with his friends, whom we'll talk about in just a moment. Job is going to say some things that are wrong. He's going to say some things that get him into trouble with God. So don't apply those two statements to the whole book, just to the sections that immediately precede them. Now, Job's friends, we're introduced to them at the end of chapter 2, beginning in verse 11. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. There's actually another character who's going to come along later in the book. He doesn't come just yet. But these three friends, it says they met together and they came to Job because they'd heard about everything that had happened, and they come to sympathize with him, and they come to give him some consolation. And I love what the text says, chapter 2, and in verse 13, they sat on the ground with him 7 days and 7 nights, but no one spoke a word to him because they saw that his suffering was very intense. Earlier, it said that they didn't even recognize Job when they saw him from a distance. These boils and his mourning and the shaved head we read about in chapter 1, they don't even recognize Job. And when they come up to him, they see, oh, this is Job. They see his suffering is so intense, they have nothing to say. They sit there for a whole week silently as they see their friend in his silence. It's interesting that when Job's friends begin to open their mouths, beginning in chapter 4, we're going to find that when they speak, they actually do more harm than good. And the best thing that Job's friends probably ever did for him in this book is what's said at the end of chapter 2. They came to be with him, and they didn't say anything. One of our 4 questions that we're reading as we go throughout the book of Job is, how can we take the things in these chapters and use them as we try to help people who are hurting? I think there's a good lesson for us here. Sometimes people need our presence, not so much our counsel. Maybe they need a hug, but not our advice. And I think sometimes when we see someone who's grieving, we say something just to keep from saying nothing. You know, we feel like we have to have something to say. We feel like we have to be able to offer some kind of encouraging word that's going to lift their spirits, and it comes from a good place, right? It comes from a heart that wants to serve, that wants to heal, that wants to help encourage this individual who's hurting, but we usually end up saying things that are really not all that helpful. And maybe what we need to do is just be there. Give them a hug, but keep our mouths shut. And that's what Job's friends did when they first arrived. And I think that's something good for us to consider. So let's look at what Job says in chapter 3 when he opens his mouth for the first time in 7 days. When his friends have sat there with him for that whole week, and they're not saying anything, Job is not saying anything, but finally Job is going to open his mouth in chapter 3, and he's going to give his first reaction to all of these things that have happened. So he begins, chapter 3, verse 3, it says, Job began to speak, and he cursed the day that he was born. He said, may the day I was born perish, and the night that said a boy is conceived. If only that day had been turned to darkness, may God above not care about it, or light shine on it. May darkness and gloom reclaim it, and a cloud settle over it. May what darkens the day terrify it. If only darkness had taken that night away. May it not appear among the days of the year or be listed in the calendar. Yes, may that night be barren. May no joyful shout be heard in it. Let those who curse days condemn it, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. Incidentally, in regards to Leviathan, we're going to catch that later in the book, and we're going to comment on it, I'm sure, much more fully then. So just hold off on that for now. Verse 9, may its morning stars grow dark. May it wait for daylight but have none. May it not see the breaking of dawn. For that night did not shut the doors of my mother's womb and hide sorrow from my eyes. Okay, something should be glaringly obvious to us as we're reading through this now. Job is a book of wisdom and poetry, and you really start to see the poetry here. The first 2 chapters, straight history, narrative. This is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened. Now we're getting into the poetry of the book. And so we should expect to see different kinds of language being used. We should expect to see some figures of speech and metaphors and similes and things like that. Remember all those English classes you took when you were in school. Think about all of those kinds of things when you were studying, English poetry or whatever when you were in school. Think about that genre of literature. That's where we're transitioning now. Now, what's interesting about this is when we think about poetry, we think about someone sitting down and writing a little poem. Roses are red, violets are blue, whatever. That's not the kind of poetry that we have in mind here. This is dialogue that we're about to get into. Job speaks in chapter 3. Eliphaz, one of his friends, is going to speak in chapter 4. There's going to be some back and forth exchange. They're not speaking in poetry in the sense that everything rhymes or, they're trying to speak this beautiful language. That's not the idea. But notice that the shift in genre has taken place, and we should expect some different things accordingly. Now, Job says, verse 3 through verse 10, the night that I was born I wish it had been done away. I wish I had never been born. I wish those days had perished. Then in chapter 11, in chapter 3 in verse 11, he says, why was I not stillborn? Why didn't I die as I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me? Why were there breasts for me to nurse? Now I would certainly be lying down in peace. I would be asleep. Then I would be at rest with the kings and the counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruined cities for themselves. Continuing on in verse 15, he says, or I would be with the princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not hidden like a miscarried child, like infants who never see daylight? There the wicked cease to make trouble, and there the weary find rest. The captives are completely at rest. They do not hear a taskmaster's voice. Both small and great are there, and the slave is set free from his master. So he starts off with this curse of the day that he was born. And now he says, I wish that I was dead. I wish that I had been stillborn, or I wish I'd been miscarried instead of being born. I wish my life had never even come to me. Now in verse 20, why is light given to one burdened with grief, and life to those whose existence is bitter, who wait for death, but it does not come, and search for it more than for hidden treasure, who are filled with much joy, and who are glad when they reach the grave? Why is life given to a man whose path is hidden, whom God has hedged in? I sigh when food is put before me, and my groans pour out like water. For the thing I feared has overtaken me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I cannot relax or be calm. I have no rest, for turmoil has come. So Job now says, I have this life that's just full of suffering and misery, and why am I even still here to just suffer and be miserable? Why not go ahead and finish me off? Take my life. I don't even want to be here. And so at this point, when Job is the first one to speak, now he opens up his mouth and he says all of these things. I wish I'd never been born, and all those things we just read about just take my life. You think about Elijah, right, in the book of 1 Kings, when Jezebel is after him. 1 Kings chapter 19, he says, I am alone and left. I'm the only one who's still serving the Lord. Just take my life. If this is the way it's going to be, I know Jezebel's coming after me. I just wish I was dead. Well, Job is saying some of those same things here. But now that Job has spoken and broken that 7-day silence, then in chapter 4, which we're going to read tomorrow, now his friends are going to start opening up their mouths and speaking their mind too. So here's one other thing that I want to consider with you or leave with you before we close this video. Again, thinking about that question, how can we help those who are hurting themselves? Need to phrase that better. How can we help those who are hurting? I don't mean hurting themselves. How can we help those who are hurting? Sometimes we need to let them speak first. We talked about sitting in silence and being there, but not necessarily saying anything. And we wonder, well, when is my friend who's hurting going to be ready to talk? When will they be ready to open up? When are they going to be ready to share their grief? Let them tell us. They'll do it when they're ready. They'll open up when they're ready to open up. Let them speak first. And let them say what they think needs to be said. Let them speak what's on their heart. We're going to have a lot to say as we go through this book about the dialogue between Job and his friends. What's helpful, what's not helpful, etc. But I think as we are now moving into this early stages of opening the discussion, there is a lot here where Job and his friends are grappling for things and grasping. They're grappling with things. They're grasping for things that are beyond their reach. And it seems that the book of Job is an effort on their part to try and explain things that are not easily explained, maybe even not at all explained. They're trying to understand, why does God let these things happen? Why did God do these things to me? And they're going to give some answers. They're going to give some conjecture and some speculation. And at the end of the book, they're going to find out everything you've said is wrong. That's a valuable thing for us to keep in mind. Sometimes there are no explanations. Sometimes there are no things that are that make sense. There is nothing that helps us understand, grapple with. We may never fully know why certain things happen, and we have to be okay with that. So that's chapter 2, chapter 3. Thanks for reading along with me today. I hope this has been helpful to you. God bless you.